resistance included arson, assault, murder, and those were incidences of slave resistance that took place. So let's talk a little more about the slave patrol. Members of the slave patrol did not generally pursue runaways when they were on duty. The recapture of enslaved fugitives were left to the slave catchers. And the slave catchers were not generally the slave patrollers because they were paid a higher salary and they could cross state lines. And so we see this particular notice is kind of not in the right chronology because it's from 1851, but it talks about slave catchers, so I used it. And so these slave catchers that they're talking about in Boston in the 1850s, because they could cross state lines, they're looking for Southern runaways, but here they are in Boston. And so slave patrols worked within their community. Ordinary citizens received rewards if they turned in runaways, and overseers went after those who were enslaved on their plantation. The policing of enslaved people did not take place the policing of enslaved people did not only take place in the South, but slave patrolling also took place in the North, in the colonies of New England as well. So this is the case in the 1720s when Boston and surrounding towns are under attack. They believe they're under attack by Black arsonists. And so for the late 1600s, Boston had already put in place a common watch of about 10 men who are on duty in Boston from sunup to sunset to look for criminals who are robbing innocent people, breaking street lights, committing burglaries, or setting malicious fires. The Common Watch monitored Boston streets to apprehend wandering and suspicious individuals. And so you know those wandering and suspicious individuals would include enslaved people, Native American servants, and even white indentured servants who were out and about without their master's permission. So when a series of suspicious fires lit up Boston in the spring of 1723, the residents feared that enslaved people were trying to burn the town down. And so it's in my own work that I look at New England and slave arson. And so I know that there were more than 10 fires or 15 fires that were set during this time. So during this time when these fires are taking place, the Common Watch was increased from 10 people to another 15, so 25 people. Not only were those 15 people added to the Common Watch, but 20 members, I'm getting confused here, I'm sorry. So during this time of hysteria, also an armed militia consisting of 50 men were called up whenever a fire broke out. So we have an enlarged Common Watch that is now 25 people. And then we have this armed militia that's called out whenever a fire broke out. And then another 20 white males organized themselves into a makeshift watch to help look for these Black arsonists. In fact, Lieutenant Governor William Doomer issued a proclamation that promised a reward of 50 pounds for any resident who identified those Black arson suspects. he called them dangerous Negroes, but I use Black arson suspects. It was during this time of heightened fear that the 9 p.m. curfew was instituted in Boston. Group meetings were prohibited because they were fearful that Black and or Native Americans would get together and plan additional acts of arson. So Southern slave patrols and Northern common watches remained in place during the American Revolution in the 1770s. However, the availability of men to work in these roles decreased given the demand of able-bodied men to serve in the American and British armies, since that was a priority. Southern slave owners had to rely on their overseers to do their slave patrolling. Relying on overseers to do slave patrolling did not become a major problem until Governor William Dunmore of Virginia issued his proclamation in 1775 that promised freedom to any enslaved man who fought on the side of the British during the war. This proclamation offered freedom, and so massive numbers of enslaved people ran away. With no available men to work as slave patrollers during the Revolutionary War, tens of thousands of enslaved men and women took advantage of the chaos of war to run away. Their American masters had not offered them freedom for fighting, so they took their chances on the British for a glimmer of hope. And so we know that 5,000 Black men fought for the Patriot cause, but over 20,000 enslaved men fought for the British. It is estimated that over 80,000 to 100,000 enslaved persons heeded the call and ran away during the American Revolution. While thousands joined the British forces, several thousands ran to southern towns. They ran to southern and northern cities where they hid out in free Black communities. Some ran to the swamps in the South, and others ran to the uncharted frontier. With no slave patrols to stop them, they just ran. We know that Georgia lost 1/5 of their slave population. Thomas Jefferson lost over 30 enslaved persons, and George Washington lost 17. Another 20,000 left when their loyalist masters went into exile in Britain, Canada, the British Caribbean, and East Florida, a loyalist stronghold. The ending of the American Revolution did not bring an end to slave patrols in the North. The ending of the American Revolution did bring an end to slave patrols in the North, but not in the South, where over 400,000 persons of African descent were held in bondage. The Southern patrols reconstituted themselves and continued their surveillance, their harassment, their detainment, and whipping of enslaved persons in the antebellum period from 1800 to 1860 before the Civil War. The typical slave patrol consisted of 2 to 3 patrollers riding horseback on a weekday night, with as many as 7 riding patrollers accosting Blacks who just wanted to enjoy their time off on the weekend. Not only did patrollers check for passes, they monitored the comings and goings of enslaved people at all times. They often laid in wait along the off-beaten paths to surprise unsuspecting Blacks who took the back roads. Continuous harassment did not stop enslaved persons from resisting whenever there was slavery. There was resistance. Any threat of rebellion made whites fearful. So a fully armed militia with slave patrollers usually stood ready to pursue slave conspirators. A deadly rebellion like that led by Nat Turner in Southampton, Virginia in 1831 left over 50 whites dead. In the end, Turner and 50 of his rebels were tried, convicted, and executed. Unbelievably, more than 100 Blacks were killed on the spot without the benefit of trial. During the height of the Turner Rebellion, slave patrollers remained on guard, stopping and arresting mostly innocent persons. The slave patrols antagonized, intimidated, and tortured Blacks while looking for conspirators in a house-to-house search for miles around the location of the Turner Rebellion. During the antebellum period, the federal government even got involved in slave catching when a more stringent fugitive slave law was passed as part of the Compromise of 1850. Federal agents were paid $10 for each captured runaway. But you're thinking $10 is not a lot of money, but in today's money, that $10 would be $300. Under this new fugitive slave law, ordinary citizens were required to assist federal agents when they were in active pursuit of fugitive slaves. If the citizen refused to help capture a fleeing fugitive, they faced a fine of $1,000. Now that's $30,000 in today's money, as well as 6 months in jail. Basically, the federal government was now in the business of slave catching. And so this slave catching poster that I showed is during the antebellum period. It's 1 year after the fugitive slave law was passed. And we know that many enslaved people in the South sought refuge in Boston, including Anthony Burns, I forgot Shadrach's last, Shadrach Meekins as well. And so this notice is about slave catchers under the fugitive slave law coming into Boston to pursue fugitive slaves. And so most slave patrollers did not like to pursue runaways, since it would require them to give chase into the swamps or into the mountains. The slave patrollers didn't want to go through all that. They just wanted to go through the roads and see who they could catch that didn't have a pass and shouldn't be out at night. But when runaways, when that took place on their watch, they were expected to help out, but they didn't like having to chase them into the swamps. Consequently, enslaved persons on the run knew that these were the best places to hide from the slave patrol. Unsurprisingly, there were occasions when enslaved people sought retaliation against slave patrollers. If an enslaved person reached the brink of their tolerance, they sometimes retaliated by physically assaulting slave patrollers or sometimes burning down their houses. Enslaved people were often pushed to the brink when slave patrols policed their bodies with close surveillance, intimidation, physical abuse, and imprisonment. However, there was somewhat relief at the start of the Civil War, since there were fewer white men available to patrol. The Confederate Army had a mandatory draft, and so every able-bodied white person had to fight. With so many men off to war, the duties of patrolling went to men who were too young or men who were too old to fight, or to vigilante committees that cropped up to fill in the gap. Some slave owners even hired private patrollers to track down runaways from their plantations. These makeshift patrols were unable to stop tens of thousands of enslaved people from running to the Union lines for their freedom, which in turn emptied many plantations of their free labor source. 6 months after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans faced the vigilante policing of a white mob during the draft riot in New York City in July 1863. Fear that the newly freed Blacks would take their jobs led working class whites in New York City to burn the draft offices, personal residences, and businesses while killing at least 119 Blacks. They burnt the colored orphanage, which left hundreds of children homeless and without needed resources. So while back in the South, the slave patrol after the Civil War just slowed, but did not end the patrolling of 4 million newly freed. This is a picture of the urban slave patrol in Richmond, Virginia, after the turn of the war. The slave patrol after the Civil War just reestablished themselves under the guise in the post-war to continue policing Black bodies. In the countryside, patrols used anti-vagrancy laws to force former slaves to sign contracts that returned them to working on plantations. If these new Black American citizens did not have a work contract, they were arrested for vagrancy, thrown in prison, and forced to work off their fine on a plantation. Post-war patrols soon aligned with the Ku Klux Klan that emerged during the last year of the war in 1865. These vigilante mobs, with their white robes and hoods, terrorized the newly freed population, particularly successful Blacks. Racial terror was so rampant, Congress passed the KKK Act of 1871, making it illegal to prevent the newly freed from enjoying their constitutional rights. But even this federal law could not stop KKK violence. Patrols assisted by the KKK monitored the movements of newly freed people by requiring them to carry passes. Now, this is after the war, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And African Americans are required to carry passes. They forced former slaves back on the plantation in what was a quasi-slavery. With its terrorizing night visits, torture, and lynching, the KKK remained the right arm of post-war patrols as the South entered the Jim Crow era. By 1880, at least 10,000 Black men and women were arrested in the state of Georgia for such minor offenses as theft, not paying debts they did not know they owed, using obscene language, or planting cotton after sunset. Whatever kind of crime they could come up with to arrest African Americans, it was used. They were arrested and forced to work off their sentences and fines on cotton plantations and in mines across the state. One example, Joseph Brown, he forced Black convicts to work underground in his coal mines for 6 straight days without sunlight. And if any of these Black convicts dared to run away after being whipped, underfed, and overworked, they were relentlessly pursued by patrols or by sheriffs who brought them back in shackles to their work site. And so convict leasing was just slavery by another name. When convict leasing was not enough to control Blacks, vigilante whites used intimidation, violence, and even murder in the form of lynching. Lynching was the public hanging of an individual in a mob action conducted outside the law. Large crowds of whites who brought their children sometimes gathered to view these spectacles. The local police and the courts did nothing to protect these Black victims from being murdered. Ida Wells Barnett, Ida Wells Barnett, whose picture I feature here, a newspaper owner. She was a teacher, newspaper owner, reporter who completed research on lynching, found that most victims were Black males who were falsely accused of raping white women, or they were successful Black businessmen. There were more than 3,500 documented cases of lynching, with most of the cases taking place in Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia. With the toppling of Reconstruction and the ushering in of Jim Crow, African Americans remained subjected to stringent segregation and unrelenting discrimination. So when the opportunity to escape their relegation to sharecropping, separate but unequal institutions, disenfranchisement, and KKK violence in the early 1900s, when that opportunity came, over 1.5 million African Americans left their lives, their families, and communities in the South for better jobs, schools, housing, and the right to vote in the North. As this pattern of northward migration continued, whites in the South tried to prevent their main source of labor from leaving their towns. They prevented recruiters from speaking to Black employment recruiters from speaking to Black residents. They arrested Blacks for vagrancy during harvest time. And some even resorted to trying to stop Black individuals from boarding trains headed for the North. Many Black migrants had to flee the South under the cover of darkness. Both world wars provided new opportunities to millions of Black men and women who not only enlisted in the military, but also worked in industrial jobs in the nation's defense plants, even if it was in the lowest paying jobs. Along with these expanded opportunities in the North came racial violence. The summer of 1919, during World War I, was known as the Red Summer for the blood that was shed in race riots initiated by whites. During this year of 1919, lynching increased from 36 incidents in 1917 to 76 incidents in 1919. We must never forget the massacre of innocent African American families at the hands of vigilante mobs in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, and in Rosewood, Florida in 1923. The 18-hour attack on what was known as a Black Wall Street in the thriving Greenwood community in Tulsa destroyed several businesses, churches, hotels, and stores, also leaving 300 Blacks dead. Similar in Rosewood, Florida, a raging white mob of over 500 men specifically targeted Black families before completely burning down the Rosewood community. The motivation for these racial attacks in Tulsa and Rosewood were false accusations of a young Black man harming a white woman. The extreme justice meted out to the Scottsboro Boys in 1935 in Alabama, when they were falsely convicted and sentenced to death after being accused of rape, is another example of the legal lynching that took place in the Jim Crow South. After the alleged rape victims recanted their testimony, the Supreme Court did overturn the convictions and sentences of these defendants, and all but one will eventually be pardoned. One had to stay in prison a little longer than the others. In 1943, during World War II, there were 242 race riots waged across 47 cities in the United States, including Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia. The 1.5 million Black men and women who served in the two world wars were put in all Black units with mostly white commanders. They were deemed intellectually and psychologically unfit to fight in combat, except for the highly trained Tuskegee Airmen and the 92nd Infantry Battalion. Black soldiers were often met with violence from angry white mobs in the towns surrounding their army bases. Black servicemen, like my father, who fought in World War II, were relegated to transportation duties or manual labor jobs, while Black female WACs and WAVEs were assigned housekeeping and not nursing jobs. Black soldiers could not eat in Jim Crow restaurants in the South, even though German prisoners of war were served at these establishments. Double V became the rally cry of the Black soldier. They were fighting for freedom from fascism in Europe, but they were also fighting for freedom from racial injustice at home. The horrific torture and murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955 was exposed to the world. His mother had an open casket to show what Ku Klux Klan members had done to her son. And when the world saw this tortured body of this young man, it ignited the civil rights movement to greater heights. We know that the year-long, hard-fought Montgomery bus boycott took on Jim Crow segregation and won. The victory in the bus boycott brought a new kind of energy to the civil rights movement under the leadership of Reverend Martin Luther King. King incorporated the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi in his nonviolent challenge of racism. However, this peaceful protest was also met with violent policing by local, state, and federal officials. When 9 Black students tried to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in September 1957, they were met with angry mobs that screamed, "Lynch them, lynch them," as the National Guard raised guns in their faces to prevent their entry into the school. This is a clear example of how federal law enforcement agents policed Black bodies during the civil rights movement. We know that in the Little Rock Nine, Eisenhower will come around and he'll later send federal forces, National Guard, to protect the students as they enter the school. But initially, the state called out the National Guard to prevent the students from entering the school. The 4 students from North Carolina A&T College were refused service at a Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960 during a student sit-in. And while they sat at this counter in the Woolworth store, they were bullied, spit upon, and had ketchup spilled on their heads. We know that Birmingham, Alabama was known as Bombingham, since there was a high number of bombings taking place in that city. The racial terror that racked this southern city was perpetuated by the notorious Bull Connor, police chief in Montgomery. And he used water hoses, dogs, and police batons to attack young Black protesters in Birmingham. I said Montgomery, I'm sorry, in Birmingham. No one will ever forget the historic March on Washington that Martin Luther King led, that was for jobs and freedom, on August 28th, 1963, that drew over 250,000 people of all races and ethnicities to the National Mall. But we can't forget the horrific killing of the 4 girls by a bomb in September 1963 at the 16th Street Baptist Church. This killing rocked the nation. Such killing of innocent African Americans are a keen example of the deadly policing of Black bodies. And very much like the fiery protests we saw following the murder of George Floyd, cities across the country ignited into flames after Reverend Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. This was also a time that Malcolm Little, later known as Malcolm X, emerged as an independent-minded Black nationalist who challenged African Americans to defend their community from the racial violence that the world witnessed in Birmingham. Malcolm X cautioned Blacks to develop and defend their communities by any means necessary. He was a member of the Nation of Islam led by Elijah Muhammad, a Black nationalist who advocated political and economic control of Black communities. Malcolm X preached that African Americans needed to develop economic uplift, self-sufficiency, and racial pride. He explained that racial pride comes by understanding that Black is beautiful. Malcolm X stressed that Blacks needed land, power, and freedom, and they did not need integration. African Americans were a nation within a nation, and so Malcolm X then even called for a revolution based on bloodshed to break the stranglehold of white policing of Black bodies. After making a life-changing pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964, Malcolm X changed his name to El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, broke with the Nation of Islam, and formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity a short time before he was assassinated by the members of the Nation of Islam on February 21st, 1965. Hearing Malcolm X's message to defend and protect Black communities by any means necessary, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was organized by Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton at Merritt College in Oakland, California in October 1966. They took up the fight against hostile police repression. These young and militant Black nationalists made resistance to police. These young and militant Black nationalists made resistance to police brutality their mission. But they also focused on structural inequalities in American society, including poor schools, lack of healthcare, and poverty. The Black Panthers had a 10-point program that called for self-determination, full employment, no draft during the Vietnam War, ending criminal injustice, and ending police brutality. The mostly male members of the Black Panther Party projected a hyper-masculine identity by carrying unconcealed weapons. Without question, this stance of Black militancy increased the harassment from police in the form of illegal searches, false legal charges, and arrest, as well as violence and death. Such police retaliation was the start to increasing the incarceration of men of color. In 1967, J. Edgar Hoover and his secret FBI counterintelligence forces, COINTELPRO, infiltrated the civil rights and Black Power movements. We know that he had an open file on Martin Luther King, and we know well how Angela Davis was falsely accused of the kidnapping murder of a California judge during a botched attempt to free a Black Panther comrade during his trial. A philosophy professor by training, Angela Davis represented herself and obtained a full acquittal of all charges. While less known is the case of Assata Shakur, and I apologize for not having a picture of Angela or Assata with me, a Black Liberation Party member who was convicted of killing a New Jersey state trooper after a shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike in 1973. The Black Liberation Party represented a more militant arm of the Black Power movement since they claimed responsibility for acts of violence in their fight against racial oppression in the United States. Shakur admits to being present at the time of the shooting, but denies shooting anyone. It was by a well-coordinated scheme by the Black Liberation Party revolutionaries to break Shakur out of prison that was successful. Assata Shakur has lived in exile in Cuba as a political prisoner of the United States since November 1979. The way law enforcement continued its policing of Black bodies after the Black Power movement is what led to mass incarceration of Black men. The discriminatory targeting of young Black men began in the 1970s with the law and order policies developed by President Nixon, continued by President Reagan, and reinforced by President Clinton. Under the guise that only young Black Americans used and sold crack cocaine, sent thousands of persons of color to prison for mandatory prison sentences that were disparately higher than the sentences meted out for the use and sale of powdered cocaine, the drug of choice for white Americans. And so the cycle of mass incarceration continued with the deliberate targeting, unnecessary arrests, and disparate prison sentences for persons of color at the hands of the police. In 2013, the Bureau of Justice reported that African Americans, who are estimated to be 13 to 14% of the US population, were 38% of the state prison population, while whites, who are 62% of the US population, are 35% of the state prison population. Such policies that specifically target Black men, like stop and frisk, has led to mass incarceration. It is estimated that 88% of the almost 200,000 Black men who were stopped and frisked in New York City in 2013 were innocent. 88% of those who were stopped and frisked of the 200,000 who were stopped and frisked were innocent. Another disparate police policy perpetuated against African American men is their arrest for minor crimes like selling loose cigarettes or passing a supposedly counterfeit $20 bill. The problems of high unemployment, crime, drugs, police brutality, and criminal injustice are the structural realities that result in more young Black men going to prison than white men. This over-incarceration of young Black men remains a systemic racial problem in the lives of African Americans, despite the election of the first African American president, Barack Obama, in 2008. While President Obama defied the odds to make changes that benefited all Americans, including his taking the country out of a recession, which significantly reduced high Black unemployment, as well as offering affordable health care, the problem of police brutality and mass incarceration remained a substantial social problem in the US today. This problem of African Americans and other persons of color dying at the hands of law enforcement is not a recent phenomenon, since it has already been mentioned how Black activists like the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army faced false legal charges, incarcerations, and sometimes death. The incidents of police or vigilante violence that occurred when I lived in New York before the 1990s are forever etched in my mind. And so I often remember the violent killing of an elderly woman, Eleanor Bumpers. I knew her name then, and I know her name now, who was gunned down because when the police encountered her, she had a knife in her hand. Whether she was cooking or whether she was being assaultive, I don't know. The incident in 1986 was particularly jarring because Michael Griffith died when he was struck by a car after being chased by a mob of whites who felt he and his friends did not belong in Howard Beach, New York, a white neighborhood. Another Black man with Griffiths got away, but the other one was chased down and bludgeoned with baseball bats by this white mob. And the most tragic was the killing in 1999 of Amadou Diallo, age 22, an immigrant from Guinea, West Africa, who died in a hail of 41 bullets when New York City police mistakenly identified him as a criminal suspect. Amadou was just reaching for his wallet to prove his identity. And so I know it's like almost 8 o'clock. Could I have about 7 more minutes?
Oh, I think it's really important. I know the next 2 slides, so please continue.
Okay, thank you. And so I'd like you to indulge me for a few moments. And so I can tell you about at least 26 Black people here who lost their lives during an encounter with their local police over the past 10 years. And so we'll start with Eric Garner, 43, died when police used an illegal chokehold while arresting him for selling loose cigarettes in Staten Island in 2014. I think most of you know the face of Michael Brown, age 18, killed by the police after being suspected of stealing cigarillos in a store in Ferguson, Missouri, when he was unarmed in 2014. Tamir Rice, age 12, killed immediately on the spot when the police officers saw him with a toy gun in Cleveland, Ohio in 2014. And we all know the face of Trayvon Martin, 17, shot dead by George Zimmerman, who was with the Neighborhood Watch Patrol in Sanford, Florida, because he looked suspicious. And so in 2020, Ahmaud Arbery, 25, killed while jogging by a white father and son who suspected he was a robbery suspect in Brunswick, Georgia in February 20. Breonna Taylor, 26, EMT worker, killed while sleeping in bed when the police in Louisville, Kentucky, broke into her house with a no-knock warrant intended for another house in March 2020. George Floyd, there's no one I think on this program who does not know this face. 46, died from asphyxiation after a Minneapolis police held his knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 45 minutes during an arrest for allegedly passing a counterfeit $20 bill in May 2020. Rashad Brooks, 27, was killed by the police officers who tried to arrest him in Atlanta, Georgia, for a DUI, driving under the influence while he was sleeping in his parked car. So you're getting a DUI when the car's not moving. In June 2020, and Elijah McCain, 23, killed while walking home in Aurora, Colorado, by police who stopped him and placed him in a chokehold before sedating him in 2019. We moved to Walter Scott, 50-year-old veteran, shot in the back while fleeing a policeman who stopped him for a broken taillight. The policeman claimed his life was threatened and he's shooting him in the back. Stephon Clark, 22, killed by 2 policemen who stopped him when he's in his grandmother's backyard with a phone in his hand, and I guess the phone is mistaken for a weapon, in Chicago in 2018. Sandra Bland died mysteriously in jail after she was taken into custody following a heated encounter with a Waller County, Texas trooper during a traffic stop in 2015. Her death was ruled a suicide. Freddie Gray, arrested in Baltimore for possessing a knife, he fell into a coma while being transported in a small police van. The autopsy revealed that Gray died from a spinal cord injury in 2015. So whether he was roughed up to the point that he died remains an open question. Oscar Grant. Oscar Grant is kind of important to me because I was living in the Bay Area at the time of his death. It's January 1st, 2009. He's out partying with his friends, probably making too much noise as young people do. And he was handcuffed and made to sit on the floor in the subway station. And while he's sitting with the handcuffs behind him, his hands are handcuffed, the policeman, I don't know if he's still making noise, still moving, but the policeman says that he was reaching for his taser and he pulled out his gun and mistakenly shot him. Philando Castile, 32, fatally shot during a traffic stop by Falcon Heights, Minnesota police officer in the presence of his partner and his 4-year-old daughter. Now, Philando told the police he had a weapon, but he had a license for it. He's reaching, I believe it was said that he was reaching for his life, for his insurance or his papers, and I guess the police thought he was reaching for the gun, but he did have a license for the gun, and he shot in front of his 4-year-old daughter. Alton Sterling, he was killed by 2 policemen who were trying to restrain him during an arrest when he was mistakenly identified, but he did have a firearm. Now he's not the one they're looking for. His problem was that he had a firearm. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in 2006, Samuel Du Bois, 43, fatally shot by the University of Cincinnati police who stopped him for not having a front license plate and for driving on a suspended license in 2015. DJ Henry of Easton, Mass, close to home, was unarmed when he was killed by a Mount Pleasant, New York police. He was attending Pace University in New York, who tried to stop him from leaving the scene of a party that he had been attending. I.K. Gurley, killed when a policeman recklessly discharged his weapon in a dimly lit stairwell in a housing project in Brooklyn in 2014. Botham Jean, 26, killed after a Dallas policewoman entered his apartment claiming she believed that this was her own apartment and that Jean was an intruder in 2019. Sean Bell, killed by New York City police in a hail of 50 bullets when he and his two friends were driving away from a club after celebrating his bachelor party. So he was scheduled to get married very soon in 2006. Tatiana Jefferson, 28, was fatally shot while babysitting in her home when a police officer in Fort Worth, Texas, shot through her window in 2019. Janisa Fonville, 20, killed in an encounter with the Charlotte, North Carolina police. She did have a knife. It was a domestic dispute, and her encounter involved having this knife, and so she was killed. Why you can't get a knife out of the head of a woman or disable them from holding the knife, I just wonder this. Okay, so Jamar Clark. Jamar Clark was shot and killed in police custody in 2015 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Witnesses say he was handcuffed while the police said he was not. The police said he reached for their gun and was resisting arrest. And this is Aura Rosa, 40, shot and killed in an encounter with the Michigan police that involved also a possession of a knife after a domestic dispute. Michelle Kasu, 50, mental health patient, killed in 2014 during an encounter with the police in Phoenix, Arizona, after she made threats to the agency workers and she had raised a hammer over her head. And last and not least, because there are others that I did not or could not mention at this time, Gabriela Navarez, 22, lost her life in a hail of bullets after she engaged two Sacramento, California police in a high-speed chase that turned combative in 2014. And I'm just going to finish up real quickly. And so here we are, 2020, and police violence is still a major indicator of systemic racism in the United States. Of the 26 pictures featured in my presentation, 4 of these shootings took place in the first 6 months of 2020, 3 in 2019, 1 in 2018, 2 in 2016, 6 in 2015, 6 in 2014, and 1 in 2012, 2010, 2009, and 2006, respectively. We have seen a surge of community unrest and protests since 2014. Since time and again, police officers have not been punished for their acts of violence. In fact, of the 26 shootings in my presentation, the only policemen who were indicted and served prison time were those involved. Was a policeman involved in the killing of Oscar Grant. He got 6 months manslaughter. George Scott, the policeman, George Scott was running away and the policeman said his life was threatened. He got 20 years. And Botham Jean, the recent killing, the policewoman received 10 years. The officers, and so such a low rate of police accountability for the crimes is the reasons that Black Lives Matter was born. Last slide, sorry to go over. The Black Lives Matter movement was a call to action in response to state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism that has consumed this country for most of its history. Organized by these founders, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tomete, in the wake of the Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown murders. This impactful local movement has built political power and intervened when violence was inflicted on Black communities. The Black Lives Matter has led to the ouster of anti-Black politicians and won critical legislation to benefit Black lives. And it has changed the debate about Blackness around the world. The leadership and involvement of the Black Lives Matter movement during the protests that rocked the nation after George Floyd was murdered that fateful day on May 25th, 2020, was seen not only in the United States, but across the world. This monumental unification of a myriad of people of all genders, ages, races, and ethnic groups to protest yet another unjustified killing of a Black man in police custody is something that had not been seen in our lifetime. Black Lives Matter protests peaked on June 6th, when 500,000 people turned out in nearly 550 locations across the United States. It is estimated that 15 to 26 million people in the United States have participated in these demonstrations. This is the largest social movement in the country's history. And without a doubt, this wave of protests led by the Black Lives Matter has put our nation on a trajectory of freedom, equality, and racial justice that is long overdue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lewis.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing some of the names. It is a profound history that we have inherited today. This is now a time, if people have questions, where they can let me know what their questions are. They can use the chat stream here in Zoom. I do have one question that came across from Facebook, and it came rather early in the presentation. The question was looking for some more understanding of the difference between, yeah, we can take the slides down and just see each other if you like.
Okay, should I just?
Yeah, you can just stop sharing your screen if you like.
Okay.
The question was just looking for some distinction between people who are working on the slave patrols and people that worked as slave catchers. And I know you and I spoke a little bit about that difference. So maybe you can help educate everybody with us tonight about what the difference was between those different roles.
Sure. And so slave patrols were local entities. They were local to a community, to a town. But slave catchers worked in every community. They worked in every state. And so the slave catchers that noticed in Boston, these are slave catchers coming from the South because they're looking for Southern runaway slaves. So here they are in Massachusetts, and you're being told to beware, there's slave catchers here. And so slave patrols are local. That community have hired these individuals to kind of look out and monitor the going-ons of enslaved people, of Native American servants, or even white indentured servants as well. And so that's the difference. A slave catcher. Now, a lot of plantations would send out its people, its overseers, or other individuals on that plantation to look for their people. But many times, slave masters couldn't travel from the South to the North, so they would hire professional slave catchers.
Thank you. So another question is bringing this current and asking for some reflection as a professor. When you deliver this or portions of this course to your students, what's the main lesson that you hope people take away?
What a good question. I think what I would like students to leave with an understanding that the discrimination, the racism, the racial terror that African Americans have suffered with and continue to suffer has been with us a long time, and it's been with us for too long. And so it's important to know that history and to know, if we don't know that history, then how do we move away from that history? And so I just want them to know that this didn't start with Michael Brown or Trayvon Martin. You know, this policing of Black bodies started 400 years ago in the 1600s with the founding of the colony called Carolina, later known as South Carolina. So 400 years is the extent of this history. So yeah, that's what I would like them to know. That I like them to know the history of this of African Americans in this country, you know. And not to say that there hasn't been some progress. I'd be the last one to tell you. I'm an example of that progress. So, but too many have been left behind. So, yeah.
Thank you. There's another question. I think it's kind of twofold, but I'll ask the question as it's been raised, and then we'll see where it goes, and maybe we'll ask a follow-up. Wondering if you have ideas about how to advocate to make sure that this history of our country and how Black people have been, well, everything that you just told us, how do we make sure that history is incorporated into public education and public curriculums?
Yeah, I think that's an important conversation that has to be held on many levels. It needs to be held on the secondary school level. It needs to be held on the college level. And so, you know, we each can do a part. I'm sure on this call, I might have a teacher or two that can, you know, talk to their curricular committee. How do we include a book about slavery? How do we include a book about the slave patrols? How do we include a book about civil rights? And on the college level, you know, the same thing has to happen, administrators and teachers. I've been fighting to teach a class on African-American history at every institution I've taught at here in New England, and there's been several. And still it's a fight, you know, so I'm not going to name the institution in Boston that does hire me to teach it, but at the community college level, it's been a real fight. I taught it at one school for about 3 years, and then they took the course away from me. So, you know, we just have to keep pressing, you know, and hopefully this new awakening that we're all experiencing, hopefully that will help.
And, you know, the courses that you've taught have been elective courses, I'm sure. They weren't required for every student. And yet this is part of our common history that everybody needs to know. So people shouldn't be waiting until community college or, you know, into higher education to be finding this out. I mean, I wonder, how do you have ideas about, you know, as I know, as in addition to being a professor, you're also a parent, and, you know, you've known other young people. How do you start teaching this history, which is rather crushing? I mean, this is just you know, 400 years of blood and just horror. How do we start teaching that to young children? Do you have thoughts about how to kind of gradually bring people to this realization without just like, I don't want to scar our 5-year-old, you know, idealists, but they need to know at some point. How do we do that?
Well, being a parent, my son was well versed in African American history because probably I bought him books that he was interested in, but I also bought a lot of Black history books. But I can give you an example of how we can even do this on a community level. I work with the Brockton area NAACP, and our education committee took on a project to share some Black history books with some of our Brockton school children. And so we just gave out over 100 books to a summer program that Brockton was holding for students that needed a little more remediation. And we chose some books in Black history. We chose Frederick Douglass' narrative for some middle school students, not the traditional narrative that I teach in college, but this was a version written for younger generations. And we gave students this information. So I think as parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles, sometimes you just need to introduce, there are a lot of good stories out there. I'm trying to think, and sometimes if I have my head all in this talk, I can't think about other things, but Ruby Bridges is an interesting story of a little girl in the civil rights movement who had to take educational and maybe psychological tests in order to integrate into the school as the only 5-year-old in this school. Right. And she was so isolated, they chose one teacher to teach her for the first year. She couldn't be with the other students. That's an important story, and that could be shared.
And that's something that, younger children can appreciate without having to know all the history. That's
right. This is just one little girl. Her mother said, "You can do this." I don't know if I can do that at 5. And she did it. And she didn't get to really be with a classroom until her in the second grade. She had to be with this one teacher, and that teacher was from Boston or New England. So that's a plus, who taught her just by herself for that first year. So there are a lot of good stories out there, that I think that we as parents and relatives, we can share with our children. And it doesn't, and you look at the story, you read it yourself first and see if this is appropriate for your child.
And sometimes it's looking at the stories and helping even critically on it. Like I remember the way the Rosa Parks story, historically been told. There was an old lady and she was tired and she didn't want to get up. It's like,
no,
I think kids can get there. It's a little deeper than that. This is somebody who's part of a movement and, it was planned. That was not the first time she refused to get up. I think kids appreciate here's the story you're going to hear, but let me give you the real, let's talk a little deeper.
Take time to talk about it, after the child has read the book, I just worry about our children and so on the technology that they're not reading, so we have to encourage our children to read.
So on that front, and I think that's something that we can all do. There's always more we can learn. For folks who there's a question from Facebook about where, if people are looking for resources to further their own knowledge, and no longer steering away even so much for kids, but some basic intro text, what do you use for your classes? Are there good texts that you would refer people to?
I got many good. I can spill off of. I can, when I talked about the Nat Turner rebellion, and I talked about the slave patrol going from house to house. They wanted to see if there was any evidence that any of these people participated in the rebellion. One of the books that bring that whole experience out is a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. And you have to be a little careful with it because she was under the threat of sexual assault by her master throughout the book, under the threat. And so you might not pick that for younger children, but for adults. When I first read this book, before I even became a historian, I was just so thrown by it that I bought a copy of the book and sent it to each one of my sisters. Well, you got to read this book, But other books, I have my students read when it comes to slavery, not just Southern slavery, but New England slavery. Mr. and Mrs. Prince, which talks about an 18th century enslaved couple that are able to get their freedom. They become landowners, and they just fight to be free. What an excellent story. Mr. and Mrs. Prince. There's a book, Aren't I a Woman, that talks about Southern slavery. Of course, Frederick Douglass' narrative. anybody interested in understanding the institution of slavery from a personal perspective must read Frederick Douglass' narrative. And I could probably send you, Clayton, some other names, but just off the top of my head, those are some of the books that I assign my students so that they could get a good view of slavery in this country.
Thank you. I would be happy to share that list if you want to email it to me.
Yeah,
I'd be happy to make that available to folks who are interested.
Yeah, since I teach African American history from the transatlantic slave trade to Black Lives Matter, I could probably come up with some other books. But of course, my specialization is early American history, particularly New England slavery. So I can name those off the top of my head. But the later part, I might have to do a little research for you.
Well, that's great, and I can help people, find links so they can borrow them.
Yeah,
they can read them, and then
I'll try and work on that before classes start.
That's awesome. I know you and I talked about a couple. There's the 13th on Netflix right now. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that and any other movies that you'd recommend people watch too.
Oh, movies. I'm not a really big movie buff, but one of the recent movies that I saw, since I've been quarantined since March, there's a really good movie about Madam C.J. Walker that's on Netflix, which I really enjoyed. A person that came from absolutely the bottom when it came to poverty and became one of the first millionaires in this country in the early 20th century. The movie about Justice Marshall and his early days as a lawyer, and some of the cases that he used. 12 Years a Slave, of course. I have my students watch 12 Years a Slave, but I also have my students watch Roots. And for any people that have joined us tonight that has never watched the original, not the remake, but the original version of Roots, that's a starting place. I'm trying to think of, there's so many. I think Brian Stevenson's recent Just Mercy, there's a lot out there. I don't even know, I know who's in it. Cuba Gooding Jr. Okay, he's in this movie about enslaved people who run away from the South, and it's the people on his plantation that come after him and the struggles they go. But in the end, I don't know the name of it, but it was a wonderful movie that he stars in, set in the 19th century. So there's a lot of good things out there that, and I'll try and think of some movies as well, if I can send that to you. Does that help?
Absolutely. I know the other one that we were talking about before is 13th.
Oh, 13, of course, the documentary 13. And understanding this problem of mass incarceration and understanding its impact today. Who's the author again? Michelle
Alexander.
Michelle Alexander, I think, does an excellent job. She's not the producer, Dugenais.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Dugenais is but Michelle Alexander is featured throughout it, and she really does talk in depth. And her book as well, The New Jim Crow.
Right.
To understand this problem of mass incarceration, I assign that as well. So portions of it kind of dense, but portions of it I assign. So, but 13 is an important documentary to understand mass incarceration.
Well, thank you. We have come. It's right about 8:30. I think we've
Okay.
answered all the questions that people have posed, but if people think of further questions, they can certainly send them to me, and I'd be happy to share them with you because we can continue this dialogue. I know I'm talking with some folks. I know at least earlier. I'm not sure if she's still with us tonight, but Nicole from March Forward Quincy and I have been talking, and I think I mentioned to you we're working on a series of conversations in Quincy and around issues that are current today that people are working on. And the first one that we're talking about is with folks that organize the Quincy for Transformative Change, the local Quincy response with the Black Lives Matter protests. And we've been talking with Tiffany and people at Eastern Nazarene with the Black Student Union there. I may be getting the name of that organization incorrect, but looking at matters that are related to race in Quincy. And having a conversation. We're looking at a couple titles. I don't want to announce a title, but we're going to be organizing this discussion series around specific titles. And so some will be about race, but we're also looking at other issues that are also that people are working on in Quincy. So I'll let you know about that. You may want to join us for that conversation. And I hope everybody who's been interested and stuck with us for tonight this is a teaser for encouraging people to keep a lookout for that and come back and engage because we have to educate, but we also have to talk to each other about, how do we
have to
represent
start talking to each other. If we don't start talking to each other, we won't get anything done. That's right. So it's very important. We can all, say, oh, that's so bad. That's so sad. But if we don't talk and plan and strategize,
that's right.
Things won't change.
That's right. Advocate for change in education, look at policies. I know that in the library, we're going through a whole effort to figure out, all right, what do we have policies that are having a disparate impact on different communities? What can we do? There's a lot of self-introspection that needs to happen in addition. So thank you for helping,
You're welcome.
Ground us in this history.
Thank you for just allowing me to talk about some issues that are, very important to me. And just having that opportunity to share the little knowledge that I do have. Thank you.
I would not call that little knowledge. There's a whole lot, and that is the tip of the iceberg. Thank you so much.
Okay,
and I know I speak for audiences. It's really appreciated. Thank you so much for sharing with us tonight.
Thank you. You have a good night.
You as well. Good night, everybody. See you again.
Bye-bye.